Hi, everyone. This is Jeffrey Thompson, Vice President and Client Partner at PK, and we're delighted that you've joined us to discuss the Media Experience Index, a really great thought leadership piece on best practices in the media and entertainment environment related to streaming. We have an illustrious panel for you today of good thought leaders on how the marketplace is shaping up and what are some of the outcomes that we see coming out of all of the competitive changes and disruptions that we're seeing in the OTT subscription video on demand streaming space. In the last 6 months, we've seen Disney launch their OTT streaming platform, Disney Plus. It's quickly risen to 73 million subs, just phenomenal growth. At the same time, Quibi launched, got in 2 quarters, and then as quickly decided to quit operations because they could not get the audience. We've seen the launch of Peacock, the rebranding of Hulu. We've seen the tremendous challenges of HBO Max. This business is rapid, it's dynamic, it's shifting. And with that being said, let's quickly get to our panel to introduce the Media Experience Index and talk a little bit about the marketplace.
So my name is Rebecca, and I work at PK in the strategy and design arm, more specifically on the insights team there. So I worked very closely with the team that conducted the research and analysis for the Media Index. We conducted a design audit and a user survey, and really brought all things voice of the customer and PK's perspective on these OTT services to life.
I'm Colin O'Neill. I'm a VP on the design team at PK. So I worked with the research team and the auditing team and kind of taking a look at the broader consumer experience of streaming, and then some of the specifics about how these platforms show up and really serve customer needs in very specific ways, and how those ways can change and evolve into the future.
So I am the managing director of what we call our integrated loyalty solutions, and I work with clients, mostly large, kind of globally recognized brands across industries, to really help kind of reshape strategy around customer engagement, retention, and loyalty. So have done a lot of work in this space around digital media and entertainment, and how these shifting platforms are really changing the engagement model with consumers and the underpinning strategies to keep them.
It's a pleasure to be here with everybody. My name is Timothy Sheehy, and I'm a VP and client partner in the media and entertainment space, along with Jeffrey. He and I sort of divide and conquer the media and entertainment landscape. My background is in television news, television production, and original productions for digital. And I think one of the things that's really fascinating is the acceleration, and we can get into a bit more of this later, but is the acceleration, I think, of change in the media and entertainment industry as a result of the pandemic. And that, of course, has driven so much activity, so much audience, and also so much investment into the streaming space. And I think what we're seeing now is a really radical and pretty permanent shift, I think, to a lot of streaming consumption. And that's probably accelerated by probably, pick your number, 5 years, 7 years. But in any case, we're definitely entering a new world here. And it's very exciting to be a part of it. And this Media Experience Index, I think, is a terrific snapshot into what's really going on in the minds of consumers and audiences, and what happens beyond pressing play, which we'll get into. So nice to be here. Thank you.
Give us the thought process around the Media Experience Index and maybe some of the key outcomes. And then underneath it, maybe one of you unpack, sort of how PK put this great piece of research together.
So the general approach of the index is really to look across the category and help establish some benchmarks around what we understand are to be really important aspects of the experience to end consumers. So we want to understand the way people perceive these services, the way that they serve their needs today, the opportunities that might be out there for different players in the space to catch up or take a leadership position. And start to understand that both in terms of the way that the services are constructed today, kind of at the interface level and the content level, but then also more broadly, how do those platforms start to think about the way that audiences are changing, the way that the platforms themselves are changing modes of consumption and content discovery, and start to think about where there's an opportunity to create new benchmarks, new experiences, and really drive the category forward.
I think Colin kind of referenced this in his description of the Media Index, but what we did when we took a look at these different services was we took a kind of critical lens to what are the components that actually makes up these services? What are those components like? And so what we were able to find was that there were really these four kind of dimensions that define these different services. It was mobility, so the fact that people are watching these different services on all different devices in all different locations. There was personalization. I think, particularly from a loyalty angle, that's something that you really can't ignore these days. And it's something that Netflix, which was, kind of one of the first services in this area, sort of staked its claim in off the bat. We also had kind of core offerings. So, the very basic things that you need to even run one of these services. You need a price, you need a subscription model, you need content. And then the last one that we really looked at, which we thought was particularly interesting, was around this idea of community. And I think particularly since, we've all been under lockdown because of COVID, community has really risen up as a kind of new area that's very critical for these services, because all of our interactions, or a lot of our interactions, have shifted to digital. So when we were looking at these services, that was something that, not only we parsed out in our own audit, but also that we wanted to get the consumer perspective on as well.
We looked across the platform, across platforms to Netflix and YouTube and Disney Plus. What services stood out? Were there any clear winners, or was it a smorgasbord of winners and losers? What was the thought process?
Well, I think one of the most interesting things, obviously Netflix performed very well as kind of, one of the most mature platforms in the space. I think what was really interesting too was how well YouTube TV performed. And I think it was really interesting to see, based on the way that we created the measurement framework for the index itself and assigned weights to the scoring, it was interesting to see that there are different ways of engaging consumers, and you get different levels of engagement based on kind of where your DNA is. So if your DNA is in content, or if your DNA is in interaction and community, as YouTube's is, you start to get a little different flavor of what those experiences could be. I think it was really interesting to see across the board. Most of the platforms performed pretty well in one or two. But I think most were challenged in some of the things that we would think are the most important, right? Which is, how do you engage with your consumers in a really direct and personal way? How do you help them find the content that's really going to resonate with them? And how do you bring them into your service? And it's been interesting to see just the different approaches that are out in the market today, how well people are doing within those personalized outreach channels or content recommendations channels, and really how much of that was happening on platform versus what's happening off the platforms. Like where is the dialogue? Where is the community connection? Where's the energy and passion about these shows? A lot of that's happening off platform in many cases.
Oh, that's interesting. Clay, I would love your thoughts on this, especially given that, YouTube TV, I was actually surprised how strong. It's like it's a silent killer, YouTube TV. Very strong scores across the board. Can you give us a little bit more underneath the hood on Media Experience Index, and then how that aligns to best practices moving forward?
So, one is this idea of thinking about engagement beyond pressing play, right? I think one of the fundamental challenges that streaming platforms have is, the idea of stickiness and how you create value beyond just the actual content itself. And when I say the actual content, I mean the shows, the movies, that people are actually, going to the dashboard on their TV or on their phone to watch the content. It's obviously an arms race, right, from a content perspective. And the challenge here is, it's a race to the bottom in terms of the financials if you can't find a way to kind of build stickiness into the product, right, into the brand. And so I think when we're looking at YouTube, for example, as you brought up, I think one thing inherent to the YouTube platform that maybe is also an interesting thing for these other platforms to be thinking about is the social dynamic, right? It is by definition a UGC platform. It's not a branded content platform, right? And so the nature of how people can interact with that, both as a viewer and as someone who is self-publishing their own content, or navigate in this, much more organic community, if you will, to find entertainment or things of interest on the YouTube platform, I think that's actually a really interesting thing for the Disneys and Netflixes of the world to start thinking about, which is how do we build more of that organic, community, more of that viral effect, more of the network into the experience of our content, of our media? Because I think that the main challenge is, where people are drawn to a particular platform because of a show, I may leave as soon as that series is over, right? And so how does the platform keep me interested and build more meaningful relationship with me beyond pressing play, as Timothy said earlier?
One of the things the survey found was that over 60% of people signed up with the intent to cancel after they'd watched a certain show or certain content. And so I think there's kind of a transactional nature to the way that people enter, but I think that the opportunity there is, to your point, Clay, is to really make it sticky and make sure that you have channels that are engaging people in dialogue around content, so that you can build upon that conversation and you can position other content in there.
Timothy, both Clay and Rebecca and Colin mentioned, just about the integrated nature of these streaming services. Can you just give us a sense of how they're, interlocking these things to actually drive change in their business or not?
Very, very briefly, I think that you touch on a very important point here, and that is, I think, really around differentiation. And, differentiation obviously is going to, if done well, lead to growth. If not done well, lead to shrinkage or retraction. One of the things that I think is really, really interesting, and I think that the Media Experience Index survey that Clay and Colin and Rebecca and their teams put together, is really pulling out this whole idea of the customer journey and then this transmedia concept, which is really the interaction and the collaboration with viewers and with audiences sort of outside that direct streaming experience. I mean, it's a mantra in the industry that content is king, and for sure, as Colin has pointed out, 62% of the people that we talk to for the MDX survey already know what they're going to watch, and by extension, what they're not going to watch when they log on to a service. So I think the challenge for a lot of these streaming companies is to really enhance or accelerate or ramp up or build that retention, that stickiness. Part of that, of course, is going to be the content experience. A part of that's going to be the UI. But I think a lot of it, too, is going to be building that transmedia experience around what happens on the screen. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities there to really look at that customer journey, build and deploy and execute intelligent lifecycle marketing strategies that touch on social media, that touch on merchandise, that touch on interactions around the actual content. And I think that if they do that successfully, they're going to solve one of the big problems that I think we see in streaming today, which is the problem of retention.
When we did this work and we saw where people were engaging in content, one of the opportunities is that these content or stories, right, are inherently social objects and always have been. But this new platform, this new paradigm has kind of changed that a little bit. So I think there's a lot of greenfield opportunity in thinking about how do you expand beyond the show. So whether it's transmedia, right, and you kind of you expand out into other media channels and you build kind of a world of content around the show itself. But I think there's also the opportunity of bringing more people together around your content, right? And I think that's going to be an important part too. We're seeing, in the survey we did, just under 50% of people were really intrigued by the idea of a social or party viewing thing, right? So how do we start to bring that together? How do we get back to the idea that these narratives, these stories, this content really is a way of helping people come together and share something, that's true and really interesting and inspiring to them? I think when we can do that, you can amplify the impact of your investment in content and make sure that you have a lot of advocates out there spreading the word for you. And that's going to be really, really important in getting people to make that choice to choose your platform or to stay with your platform when other things, might be available to them.
That's a very interesting observation, because I think what you're really talking about is the community experience. People are looking for that communal viewing experience, that communal audience experience, that communal experience around content. And a lot of that has really, in the past, been driven by theatrical experiences. Likewise, you can translate that if you're, again, doing this correctly from a marketing and customer lifecycle point of view. The streamers can translate that communal experience into a streaming universe.
Clay, I want to come to you for a minute because you've been in this business a long time, working with a number of different clients. Are there any insights that we could learn from where the industry is now and what we learned with the Media Experience Index, and also what we're seeing even in other industries?
I think one phrase or term that Rebecca and Colin, used in the report was this idea of transmedia, and trans-platform. And as we had this conversation, we're talking a lot about what is the experience beyond pressing play, and how do you, build more value into that experience for the customer. And I think that it's really indicative of how these streaming brands are starting to recognize the role of, transmedia, different forms of media, different formats on different platforms, some of which that are first party, some of which are third party platforms, right? And trying to essentially accrue more credit for the broader social conversation that happens around their shows, right? Their media. And so a really great example of this is, for those of you who may watch Lovecraft Country, HBO really did some pretty fascinating stuff around Lovecraft Country over the last few months. So they built an entire digital ecosystem around that franchise that brought a whole new level of, interaction with the story of Lovecraft Country. They even intertwined, a fair amount of social and philanthropic causes directly to that same kind of, ecosystem.
I love it. It's almost like you're eventizing and creating an excitement or a journey. And that HBO example to me is a great example of making something bigger than what it was, almost like maybe Game of Thrones tried to do early on. But Netflix pretty much never does that. They just put the content out there, which is quite interesting. Right. So Colin and Rebecca, I'm going to throw it back to you, given that your expertise in not just building the index, but also looking at sort of best practices. And I'm going to throw you a curve. And the curve is, did we see anything that you definitely don't want to do? Some really things that, boy, we need to stay away from, and it's showing up in the research?
I think there were things that we were able to see, both in terms of kind of consistency across the board. So if you look at kind of the interface, you look at kind of, the promotions, the communications around, like a lot of people were doing the same things at varying degrees of success and varying degrees of relevance based on the data that they had. But I think, we didn't see any real no-nos. I think what we saw was a fairly consistent pattern at play, and some people leveraging their capabilities much more successfully within that to do certain things, as Clay was just describing, with HBO Max, like to do things that they're naturally good at. That's kind of a core skill of their organization, and be able to kind of bring that into the platform. So, whether it's a VR event or a concert or whatever else, that stuff can exist on the same platform as the show, right? And so you start to create this digital space for all of these things to happen. Rebecca, anything else that comes to mind for you in the research?
Yeah, I think kind of two things. One big thing that I think we talked a lot about as a team as we were conducting the analysis was the idea of being kind of careful and maybe looking for more novel ways to introduce community into the platform. I think there's a risk of going a little bit too far, leaning a little bit too far into community with things like chat and commenting and ratings and things. I think we've seen services like Netflix kind of launch things like that and then roll them back because it's just a little bit overwhelming and too much noise for folks. And then at a kind of higher level, not exactly a hard no, but sort of a note of caution that we found in our research that we thought was interesting was the juxtaposition of brand ratings that we saw between SVODs and vMVPDs, so the two different types of services that we analyzed. For the most part, the vMVPDs, which are more like your kind of cable alternatives, they performed really well. And I think if you were to kind of just look at that off the cuff, you would say, oh, wow, this is great. They're doing great. No need to change anything. But when we dug a little bit more deeply into the research, what we actually saw was that the majority of early adopters, so people who are more tech savvy, more into new technology, they were the ones who were gravitating towards those services. So I think there is a need to kind of caveat some of those findings and take a little bit more of a cautious approach for those guys and say, hey, it's time to sit up and take notice of, the best practices in this space, because as less savvy tech users kind of move in, some of the satisfaction ratings and things are going to go down. So again, not any hard no's, but just kind of two caveats to some of the things that we found.
Well, you really are hitting the nail on the head. When I was at Disney, we did so well with our action movies, moving people from DVD to Blu-ray disc, and into digital. Where we struggled was getting mom to move beyond DVD to Blu-ray and digital. And so, just as one example, I love what the concept you're saying, because what got us here isn't what's going to keep us here and keep us growing this business. Let me ask another question more broadly. And what is our 2.0? Like, what's next? And we're kind of getting this with what Rebecca's saying here. But when I look at Media Experience Index, it gives us some really great insights. Where do we go from here? And what are your thoughts? I'm thinking Clay, Timothy, and Colin about how we move to the next phase of this, and are we seeing anything that just directionally tells us what's next?
Well, I'd say one thing seems pretty new right now. I believe Netflix is trialing a kind of an always-on stream. So kind of shifting back from you choose a certain show at a certain time, that there's a curated stream that kind of feels like live TV, that you can Jeffrey, you could turn on Jeffrey's stream and there'd be something playing that would align with all of your preferences and all the other shows that you've watched. So it kind of brings you back in a little bit more to almost a live TV model. I think that's being trialed in Europe right now, but I think that's kind of an interesting change. So I think if that's indicative of where things are going, there's maybe a translation of the old ways of engaging with TV and movies. I think where we are now is the new paradigm, and it's defining some of its own principles, its own rules, its own models and sense of energy, whether that is, binging certain content or whatever else it might be. But I think where we go in the future is going to bring the best of those two streams together, right? And I think it's going to be ways that make it much easier to find something that really resonates with you. I think there's going to be an aspect of being able to share that and maybe bring people together around it in new ways. And then I think, as we already touched on, it's going to be offering you more pathways deeper and deeper into that world of content.
What I think is really interesting in the MDX and sort of, where we go from here is when you look at the Media Experience Index results and you saw the level of engagement, particularly with YouTube TV, and why that really stood out. And I think when you sort of unpack that a little bit, the thing that really strikes you when you're looking at that and really kind of looking at that sort of second or third stage of research and what might help to guide the conversation with regard to where the future is going is really this, the question as to, why were consumers so engaged with YouTube TV? What was it special about them that wasn't special about the others? And I think what you're really looking at there is the level of social engagement and the degree to which second screens were being utilized while consumers or while audiences or subscribers were watching content. It's a level of interaction around that content. So I think there was a Nielsen study, which I think is embedded in the MDX, which indicates that something like 88 or 89% of American viewers are using a second screen while they are on either an OTT, an over-the-top digital streaming experience, or even on linear TV. So they're multitasking all the time. So if you're a streamer, what can you do in order to be on that second screen while your viewers or audiences are on that first screen? And I think if you can crack the code on that, you've got a very, very powerful way of broadening that interaction and encompassing a bigger part of the consumer's attention. What these streamers are really competing for is attention. And so if you've got their attention on your show or on whatever content is you're streaming, a film or TV show, and you've also got their attention on the second screen, I think you've got a very powerful win-win.
One of the long-term threats, right, to these businesses is the commoditization of the experience, right? Where you're only as good as the last awesome show you created, and everybody just has to keep dumping millions and millions and millions of dollars into having the best content, and that's the only way you keep people interested, right? that would be sort of the bleak outlook. And that might drive you to think about other industries like telecom, who, find themselves in a scrap, right? Where you see these big entrenched players, and you see a top 3 list or a top 4 list, lots of consolidation in the industry, right? Through acquisition. And those big dogs can afford to keep investing in their business and stay on top, and the smaller upstarts cannot, right? And so I think there's an interesting corollary there, and doing a lot of work in the loyalty space, and including some work in loyalty programs and rewards programs. What telcos have tried to do is they've recognized that your service is a commodity. They've recognized that at the end of the day, your connectivity, the reception on your cell phone, yes, there are some networks that are better than others in terms of coverage, but by and large, it is a commoditized service. They've recognized that, and they've invested a lot in the last 5 to 10 years on finding creative ways to bolt on other value-added products and services, including largely third-party products and services. So if I think about the experience of sitting at home, especially in lockdown during COVID, I wonder, why isn't Netflix working with Grubhub and delivering me my food for movie at home night? And so I think it's going to be interesting to see how these companies think about new revenue streams and new business models, strategic partnerships, and take a little bit of a step back from the content itself, knowing that's table stakes, right? They have to have amazing content. You can't compete without it. But the strategic question is, how do you build a better mousetrap? How do you actually change the model? How do you add something to the model? How do you evolve? And I think that's going to be a really fascinating thing to watch.
I love the where we're going here. We're going to be our last few minutes of the panel, and aside from reminding our viewers to not just listen, if you need to listen twice, do so, but go download the Media Experience Index and take a look, and then of course contact us if you have any questions, because our panel of experts is here for you. Let me just go back to any final thoughts as we approach our last few minutes.
Well, I'd start with one kind of small trend that we saw in the work was that the laptop is trending to be the primary viewing device. Right? And so I think there's, from the way that PK would look at things, we would look at what is the context that your customer is in when they are engaging with you. And I think, that context can change. There are multiple contexts. You could be, laying back on the couch with the lights dimmed watching a movie. You're very passive. But if you're on a laptop, you have a full function keyboard, you have a browser and the whole world on the internet right beside you. There are different ways of engaging, right? And so when we start to think about different contexts of use, how do you meet the consumer where they are and take advantage of the different contexts that they might be in? I think there's a lot of opportunity there. We talked about these platforms. You already have somebody on a digital platform engaging with the premier content that you've created. You have a world of content around that. There has to be other ways that that platform brings you deeper into those and helps you move between the passive consumption, laying back on the couch, and the active engagement when you're on your laptop and you're creating or you're communicating, or you're much more actively engaged in the content. So I think that kind of really aligns well with the way that PK brings a very human-centered design perspective to understanding context of use. I think there's a lot of opportunity there to expand these stories and make them much, much richer and much stickier.
I think, I guess in terms of closing thoughts, what I would see here is that there's a lot of room here for experimentation. And I think that's really exciting, because when you're experimenting, you really don't know the results, but I think having an opportunity now sort of maybe taking some of the learnings, some of the research, some of the conclusions, some of the trends that we've seen, some of the evident desire, I think, among consumers and audiences and subscribers for this sort of virtual water cooler, a digital water cooler, some place where they can get together and share experiences around the content, or share experiences even around the experience. And so I think that there's an opportunity here for streamers to do all kinds of, exciting experimental things, whether it's looking at, the UI and the UX for subscribers and saying, okay, well, let's experiment with, different A/B testing, a screen for this group and a screen for that group. Let's also maybe test loyalty programs. I think experimenting with loyalty is a lot of fun and could provide some really unexpected results. One of the things that Clay mentioned and you touched on was this thing like a movie and a meal. So, how are you trying to, again, I get back to it, that build that transmedia experience around the content, around the experience of not only the content, but also consuming that content. And so I think there's a lot of, really rich experimentation opportunities here. Loyalty, transmedia, building community, that second screen, that social media screen, the experience itself, UI, UX. And so I guess if I was, talking to the audience that I'm assuming is watching this, I would say that that's really, I think, where you could take this, have some fun, and really, I think, derive some great learnings that could fold into making the next iteration of the platform and the next iteration of the experience extremely successful.
One of the things that kind of ties into, both what Timothy and Colin were talking about is just this idea of, experimentation and the idea that there are so many different types of consumers out there for these platforms. I think we found a particularly interesting way of cutting the data and looking at people by tech adoption, but you could look at people by the types of things that they like to watch or where they're watching, what they're watching on. One of the things that makes OTT really unique and valuable in the TV space is, being internet connected, there is a lot more consumer data to be working with. And so I think finding new ways to take advantage of that and leverage that in best practices is going to be really valuable moving forward.
I mean, my closing comment would be, an area of this conversation that we didn't spend a whole lot of time on today, but is certainly really important, which is, the capability and technology side of doing all of this well, right? We talked about how do you build a strategy that engages people across different types of media, across different platforms, first party, third party. Doing that actually is quite complicated, especially as you start to think about doing personalization in a meaningful way, not a basic way, but a meaningful way that gets at really understanding who your users and your audience are, and then reaching them with the right kinds of content, exposing them to the kinds of content that they would want, or the experiences as brands rethink kind of the ecosystem that they're building around the content. So, we didn't get into the weeds on that today, but suffice to say that, there's a huge role for data sciences and MarTech and content strategy, and a lot of instrumentation that really underpins, the experimentation that Timothy and Colin and Rebecca were talking about.
So I'm going to say thank you to all of our panelists. And I want to say to the audience, this group of people, of experts that has spent dozens of years in the experience of media and entertainment is available to you. And that's why we put this together. So thank you for participating. Feel free to go download the Media Experience Index report. And we look forward to hearing from you and spending some time on your customer journey.